Hi, my name is Levi, and I did my project on the deep ocean. One of the main things you should know about the deep ocean is there's very little light down there. In fact, so little light that even in the highest points there's not enough light for photosynthesis. And then as you go down deeper, there's no light at all. And that becomes a zone where creatures have a very hard time surviving, as you can imagine. Photosynthesis is very important for all organisms, including us. We have to eat. If there was no sunlight, there'd be no grass, and then there'd be no cows eating the grass, and then there'd be no steak burgers. And we all love McDonald's. That's very important. So the deep ocean is divided into two major regions. The first region is the mesopelagic zone, and the second region would be the deep sea. So let's take a look at the first zone, the mesopelagic zone. And in that zone, there's just enough light to see the other creatures around, so they can see each other down there. I mean, it's so deep in the ocean, they can still see because their eyes are huge. They're super sensitive to light, so they can see each other. But because there's so little sunlight, there's no possibility of photosynthesis down there. So the mesopelagic zone starts about 200 meters deep and extends about 1,000 meters. So it's pretty deep down in the ocean. I mean, we wouldn't be able to survive down there, that's for sure. Another interesting thing about the mesopelagic zone is a temperature division called thermocline. Thermocline is where temperature drops drastically, like even in a small space. Because sunlight is so scarce there, the deeper you go, the more the temperature drops and the colder it gets. Let's say for organisms that move around a lot, they experience drastic temperature changes on a daily basis. So it's very difficult for them to survive there, as you can imagine. I mean, we live in San Diego. Temperature is like 80, 70. But anyways, because there's such little energy down there, organisms will actually conserve their energy. There's also organisms down there called photophores, which produce their own light. Bioluminescence is a strategy of hiding itself, where it produces light, but not in a way you think, because their bodies are so used to the cold because it's so deep down where there's no sunlight at all. One of the things they'll do is they produce a cold light, which is really weird. We think about light and we think about a lamp. That lamp, if I put my finger on it, it'd probably burn my finger, because the light we know produces heat, and they produce cold, which is kind of weird. Okay, so one thing is, during World War II, they discovered something called vertical migration. That strategy was actually detected by sonars when they're trying to track down missiles that were like shooting things, you know? They're like, oh my gosh, these aren't missiles, these are fish. Alright, another thing I want to talk about is their body design. Now, maybe you were thinking, what is their bodies like, because they're in that such constant temperature change where there's no light, so they have to, survive in severe cold and with no light and little energy. So because of that, their bodies are definitely unique. 90% of the creatures produce bioluminescence. That's actually a very important skill for them to have, as you can see, because 90% of them have it. I don't have it. I wish I had it. Obviously, it doesn't produce heat, like I said, because if it did, then it would kill them. Alright, so now that we finished talking about the basics of the mesopelagic zone, we are going on a new exploration, and we're going to find out a little bit more about the deep sea. The deep sea is where some pretty strange stuff happens, because the deep sea is located under the mesopelagic zone. So the deep sea would be no light at all. The creatures can't see each other because there's no light to see, no matter how big their eyes are, or how sensitive their eyes are to the light. These creatures are actually pretty interesting once we take a little bit of a look at them. So besides darkness and cold, one of the main factors affecting the deep sea creatures is pressure. Now, when you think about pressure, you think about something pushing on something. Because these creatures are so deep in depth, you can think about all that water piled on top of them. They have the pressure of all that water, so they have to be able to survive all that pressure. The depth of that deep sea, it is actually divided into 3 different zones in the deep sea. Those zones are the bathypelagic, the abyssopelagic, and the hadopelagic. The bathypelagic begins at 1,000 meters. Abyssopelagic begins at 4,000 meters, and the hadopelagic begins at 6,000 whopping meters of water. So because there's so little organisms down there and there's so food down there in the deep sea, organisms tend to be pretty small. They tend to have big mouths, these big giant mouths, and they have this stomach that is sometimes attached to that mouth. And what they'll do is they'll actually move slowly because they don't have a lot of energy, so they don't have a lot of energy to move around. But they'll move slowly, and they have these big mouths. Food can come into the mouths. They don't really have to do any effort, and that's one of the main issues with the deep sea. Keep on keeping on is what they do. So among the many challenges of the deep sea already, another challenge is their means of reproducing. Because they can't see any other creatures down there, it's hard to find a mate of not only the same species but the same gender. They tend to actually be hermaphroditic, which means that they produce both sperm and eggs. So something interesting to look at among the deep sea creatures is actually there's a weird occurrence called gigantism. That is where organisms actually tend to be huge down there. So there's many more things about the deep sea that I could talk about, and I don't have a whole lot of time in this video, but one of those things is hydrothermal vents, and what those are is small vents found in the bottom of the ocean where it's super cold, but what they do actually is produce heat. So you find in those situations that organisms thriving because they don't have to deal with that constant cold temperature. So that's a very interesting thing that has been discovered in 1977 in the deep sea. So that's something to look out for, and there's many more things to look out for too. We don't have a lot of time, but I hope you've learned something. And again, my name is Levi, and I hope you enjoyed this video.